"Mom, I found something," my son whispered, his voice so low it barely carried over the music, and in that moment, standing on the balcony of the house I had helped pay for, I realized nothing about that evening was what it seemed. The party inside was everything a housewarming should be: soft jazz drifting through the open doors, glasses clinking, polite laughter rising and falling like waves. But from where I stood, it all felt strangely distant, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold through a pane of glass. Daniel's new home sat on a quiet street just outside Denver, a 2-story modern build with clean lines and wide windows, the kind of place that looked effortless but cost more than most people would ever admit. I had admired it when I first walked in that afternoon, running my fingers lightly along the marble countertop, telling myself I was proud of him, that this was what all those years of sacrifice were for. And yet, as I stood beside him now, the cool evening air brushing against my skin, there was a tightness in my chest I couldn't ignore. Daniel didn't look at me right away. His hands rested on the balcony railing, fingers tapping once, then stopping, as if he were steadying himself. Inside, Olivia's voice carried clearly above the others, bright, confident, perfectly in control. She moved through the room like she owned it, greeting guests, directing conversations, laughing just a little louder than necessary. It was her house now, in every way that seemed to matter. I had noticed it the moment I arrived. Not the decor, not the expensive furniture, but the way people looked to her, not to my son, when they had a question. The way Daniel deferred, even in small things, like where to place a bottle of wine or which room to show next. It was subtle. It was quiet. But it was there. "What did you find?" I asked finally, keeping my voice steady, almost casual, as if this were nothing more than a passing comment between mother and son. He hesitated, just long enough for me to understand that whatever he was about to say mattered. Really mattered. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up his face in the dim glow of the balcony. "I didn't mean to," he said, his voice tightening. "But I saw something I wasn't supposed to see." I didn't lean in. I didn't rush him. I had learned over the years that the truth reveals itself more clearly when you don't chase it. Instead, I folded my hands in front of me and waited, listening to the faint hum of conversation behind us, the distant sound of a car passing on the street below. For a moment, I thought about how different this night was supposed to be. A celebration. A beginning. I had imagined standing in that living room, raising a glass, telling everyone how proud I was of my son, how far he had come. I had imagined feeling like I belonged there. But standing on that balcony, watching Daniel struggle to find the words, I understood something I hadn't been ready to admit before. This house might have been built with my help, but whatever foundation it stood on now, it wasn't mine anymore. Daniel turned the screen toward me, but not all the way, as if even now he was unsure whether he should be showing me at all, and I noticed the way his thumb hovered near the edge, ready to pull it back at the slightest hesitation from me. I did not move closer. I did not ask him to explain. I simply waited because I had learned that when people are afraid of what they have discovered, silence has a way of drawing the truth out faster than questions ever could. The music inside shifted to something louder, a soft burst of laughter followed by the unmistakable sound of Olivia greeting another guest, her tone warm and practiced, the kind of voice that made people feel welcome without ever revealing anything real. It was a voice I had once admired. Now, it felt rehearsed. Daniel finally exhaled and angled the phone just enough for me to see a portion of the screen. It was an email. At first glance, it looked ordinary, the kind of confirmation message people receive every day, but there was something about the names that made my stomach tighten. I saw Olivia's name. I saw a legal firm I did not recognize. And then I saw an address. This address. The house we were standing in. "I was looking for something else," he said quietly, his voice strained in a way I had not heard. Since he was a boy trying to explain a mistake he did not yet understand. It was already open on her laptop. He paused, glancing back through the glass doors as if he expected Olivia to appear behind us at any moment. She did not. She was still inside, still smiling, still playing the part of the perfect hostess. "Mom, this house," he continued, lowering his voice even further. "It is not set up the way I thought it was." I felt the words settle into me slowly, like cold air seeping through a window that had not been closed all the way. Not set up the way I thought it was. It was a careful sentence. A controlled one. But beneath it, there was something else. Something he was not ready to say out loud. I shifted my gaze from the phone to his face, studying the lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the uncertainty that had replaced the easy confidence he used to carry. For a moment I saw the boy he had been at 10 years old, standing in our kitchen, trying to tell me he had broken something and hoping I would not be angry. Back then, I had always reassured him. Back then, I had always fixed things. But this was different. I turned slightly, looking back into the house, letting my eyes move over the guests, the polished floors, the carefully arranged furniture that Olivia had chosen down to the last detail. Everything was in its place. Everything looked perfect. And yet, something about it all felt misplaced. As if the story being told inside those walls was not the same one that had brought me here. "Show me," I said finally, my voice calm, steady, giving nothing away. Daniel hesitated for only a second before scrolling, revealing more of the message, more lines of text that made less sense the longer I looked at them. Ownership structures. Signatures. Dates that did not match the timeline I remembered. I did not react. I did not let my expression change. Because in that moment, I understood something important. This was not a misunderstanding. And whatever had been done, it had not been done by accident. Behind us, someone called Daniel's name, cheerful and unaware, and he flinched slightly before locking the phone and slipping it back into his pocket. "We should go back in," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I gave a small nod and stepped toward the door, my hand resting briefly on the handle before I pushed it open. The warmth of the house wrapped around me again, along with the sound of voices and laughter, but everything felt different now, sharper, clearer. As I walked back into the room, I caught Olivia's eyes from across the space. She smiled immediately, effortless, welcoming. And in that exact moment, I realized she had no idea what her husband had just shown me. That, more than anything else, was what made me certain. Whatever game had been played here, it was not over yet. Olivia crossed the room toward me with that same effortless grace, a glass of white wine in her hand, her smile already in place before she reached me as if she had rehearsed it 100 times, and perhaps she had, because everything about her tonight felt practiced, measured, controlled. "There you are," she said warmly, her voice carrying just enough to draw a few nearby glances. "I was wondering where you disappeared to." I returned the smile, matching her tone, matching her ease, because I understood now that whatever this was, it would not be resolved with confrontation, not here, not tonight, and certainly not in front of an audience that had already decided what story they believed. "Just getting some air," I replied, my voice steady, almost light, as if nothing had shifted inside me in the last few minutes. She nodded, satisfied, or at least pretending to be, and turned slightly to gesture around the room. "What do you think?" she asked, her eyes scanning my face carefully, searching for approval, for admiration, for something she could use. I let my gaze follow hers, taking in the polished hardwood floors, the oversized windows, the expensive artwork that had not been there the last time I visited during construction. Everything was curated. Everything was intentional. "It is beautiful," I said, and it was not a lie, which made it easier to say. But beauty, I had learned, often covered things people did not want to be seen. Olivia's smile widened just a fraction, a subtle shift that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but I saw it clearly. Validation mattered to her. Control mattered even more. Behind her, Daniel stood near the kitchen island, speaking to a couple I did not recognize, his posture stiff, his movements slightly delayed, as if he were still somewhere else entirely. He glanced up briefly, our eyes meeting for a second, and in that moment, there was something unspoken between us. Not fear. Not yet. But awareness. The kind that changes everything once it settles in. You must be so proud of him. Olivia continued, her voice smooth, her hand lightly touching my arm in a gesture that felt more like placement than affection. He has worked so hard for this. I let her words hang for a moment before responding, allowing the silence to stretch just enough to be noticeable, but not uncomfortable. Yes, I said finally. He has. I did not mention the years before that. The sacrifices. The quiet decisions that had led to this moment. Some things did not need to be said to be understood, and others were better left unsaid until the right time. A guest approached then, interrupting us with a compliment about the house, and Olivia turned her attention seamlessly, shifting her focus without missing a beat, as if our conversation had never existed. I stepped back slightly, giving her space, watching the way she moved, the way she guided the room without ever appearing to do so. It was impressive. It was also revealing. I made my way slowly toward the edge of the room, my fingers brushing lightly against the back of a chair, grounding myself in something real, something solid. Every detail I had seen on that phone replayed quietly in my mind, not as a shock, but as a pattern beginning to take shape. The dates. The names. The structure of something that had been arranged carefully, deliberately. This had not happened overnight. And it had not happened without intention. I paused near the window, looking out at the darkening sky, the faint reflection of the room behind me layered over the glass. From this angle, I could see everything at once. Olivia near the center, surrounded by conversation. Daniel at the edge, slightly removed. And myself, standing just outside of it all, exactly where I had been placed without ever being told. For years I had believed I was part of my son's life in a way that could not be altered, that the foundation we built together would always hold. But standing there, watching the balance of that room, I understood something with quiet clarity. Foundations can be rewritten. Not loudly. Not all at once. But piece by piece, until one day, you realize you are no longer standing where you thought you were. I turned away from the window then, my expression unchanged, my posture calm, and took a slow breath before stepping back into the rhythm of the evening. Because whatever had been set in motion here, I was no longer simply a part of it. I was beginning to see it for what it was. And once you see something clearly, you cannot pretend you do not. I stayed near the edge of the room for a while, letting the noise of the party settle into a steady hum around me, the kind of background sound that makes people feel comfortable enough to stop paying attention, and that was exactly what I needed. It gave me space to think, to trace the path that had led here, not just tonight, but the years before it, the decisions that once felt generous and now felt incomplete. I remembered the first time Daniel told me about the house, how excited he had been, his voice lighter than I had heard it in years, describing the neighborhood, the layout, the potential. He had said it felt like a fresh start. I had believed him. More than that, I had wanted to be part of that beginning, to give him something solid to build on. At that point, my savings had been sitting untouched for years, money set aside from selling the old family home after my husband passed, money I had never quite decided what to do with because it carried too many memories to spend lightly. But when Daniel showed me the plans, when he talked about creating a place where family could gather again, something in me shifted. It did not feel like giving something away. It felt like continuing something that had already been built. I had written the check without hesitation, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me, my hand steady, my mind clear. He had tried to protest, just a little, just enough to make it seem like he understood the weight of what I was offering, but I had waved it off. It is for your future, I told him. And for ours. Olivia had been there that day too, sitting across from me, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression soft, grateful, almost careful. She had thanked me more than once, her voice warm, her eyes meeting mine with what I thought was sincerity. She had even suggested that we make sure everything was properly arranged, that my contribution be recognized in a way that protected everyone. At the time, I had appreciated that. It had felt responsible. Thoughtful. Looking back now, I could still see that moment clearly, but the feeling attached to it had changed. It was no longer warmth. It was precision. I moved slowly through the room, picking up a glass of water from a nearby table, more for something to hold than anything else, my mind continuing to thread together small details I had overlooked before. The paperwork we had signed had been straightforward, or at least it had seemed that way. Daniel had handled most of it, assuring me everything was standard, that the structure reflected what we had discussed. I had trusted him. I had trusted them. And trust, I realized now, does not disappear all at once. It erodes quietly, often without you noticing, until something happens that forces you to look at it directly. The email I had seen on his phone was not just a mistake. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a piece of a larger design, one that had been put in place carefully, step by step, with enough attention to detail that no one would question it unless they were given a reason to look closer. I set the glass down without drinking from it, and glanced once more toward Olivia, who was now laughing with a group near the dining area, her posture relaxed, her confidence unshaken. She did not look like someone who expected anything to change. And that, more than anything else, told me exactly how certain she was of the position she had secured. But certainty, I knew, can be fragile when it is built on assumptions. I let that thought settle quietly, not as anger, not as hurt, but as clarity, and for the first time that evening, I felt something steady take its place inside me. Not the instinct to react, but the decision to understand everything before I did. Because whatever had been arranged behind my back, whatever story had been written without my knowledge, I intended to read every line of it. And when I did, I would decide what came next. Daniel found me again near the hallway that led toward the study, his steps slower this time, more deliberate, as if he had made a decision between the moment we left the balcony and now, and whatever that decision was, it had weight to it. He did not say anything right away. He just stood beside me, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze fixed somewhere past the room, past the guests, as if he were trying to see something that had been hidden in plain sight all along. "There is more," he said finally, his voice low, controlled, but no longer uncertain. I turned slightly toward him, not fully, just enough to acknowledge that I was listening. "Of course there is," I replied, not as a question, but as a quiet recognition of what we both already understood. He nodded once, then gestured subtly toward the end of the hallway. "We can talk in there," he said, referring to the study, a room I had noticed earlier but had not yet entered, its door half open, its interior dim compared to the rest of the house. I followed him without hesitation, the sounds of the party fading just enough as we stepped inside to create a space that felt separate, contained, almost insulated from everything else happening beyond those walls. The room was smaller than I expected, lined with built-in shelves that were only partially filled, as if someone had begun creating a life there but had not finished. A desk sat near the window, clean, organized, with a single laptop closed neatly at the center. Olivia's presence was in the details, not in anything obvious, but in the precision of how everything was arranged. Daniel closed the door quietly behind us, not fully, just enough to muffle the noise outside, and then he reached into his pocket again, pulling out his phone with a steadiness that had not been there before. This time, he did not hesitate. He unlocked it and placed it directly in my hand. "Scroll," he said. I did. Slowly, carefully, letting each line settle before moving to the next. It was not just one email. It was a thread. Messages back and forth with the same legal firm, dates spanning months, language that was formal, structured, intentional. I saw references to ownership percentages, to transfers, to protective clauses that had nothing to do with the understanding Daniel and I had shared. And then I saw something that made everything else fall into place. A finalized document. Filed weeks ago. Not in his name. Not in both of their names. Only hers. Olivia Collins. Sole ownership. I did not stop scrolling right away. I let the information complete itself, let the pattern become undeniable before I looked up. Daniel was watching me now, not with confusion, not with hesitation, but with something closer to realization, as if seeing my reaction, or lack of one, was confirming what he had not yet been ready to fully accept on his own. "I did not sign that," he said, his voice quieter now but firm. "At least, I do not remember signing anything like that." I handed the phone back to him without comment, my hand steady, my expression unchanged, because inside, the pieces had already aligned. This was not a mistake. It was not an oversight. It was a structure. Carefully built. Carefully hidden. And most importantly, carefully timed. "You trusted her," I said simply, not as an accusation, but as a fact. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a quiet admission. "I trusted everything," he replied. I nodded once, then turned my gaze toward the desk, toward the closed laptop that sat there so neatly, so deliberately placed, as if it held nothing more than ordinary work. But I knew better now. "Does she know that you saw this?" I asked. He shook his head immediately. "No," he said. "She thinks I was looking at something else." I let a small pause settle between us, just long enough for the weight of that answer to take hold. Then I spoke, my voice calm, measured, carrying no trace of urgency or alarm. "Good," I said. Because in that moment, the most important thing was not what had been done. It was who knew about it. And right now, Olivia still believed she was the only one holding the full picture. That assumption, I realized, was the first thing that would need to change. Daniel did not speak right away after that, and for a moment we both stood there in the quiet of the study. The muted sounds of the party filtering through the partially closed door like something distant and irrelevant, as if the life continuing just a few steps away belonged to someone else entirely. I could feel his eyes on me, searching, waiting for a reaction that did not come, and I understood why. For most of his life, I had been the one who responded immediately, who stepped in, who fixed what was broken before it had the chance to become something larger. But this was not something that could be fixed with quick decisions or emotional reactions. This required something else. Something slower. Something deliberate. I walked toward the desk and rested my fingertips lightly against its surface, grounding myself not in the space, but in the clarity that had begun to form. "Listen to me carefully," I said, my voice calm, steady, leaving no room for uncertainty. "You are not going to confront her tonight." He opened his mouth slightly, as if to protest, but I raised my hand just enough to stop him, not sharply, not forcefully, just enough to hold the moment in place. "If you do," I continued, "you will lose whatever advantage you have without even realizing it." He frowned, the confusion returning for a brief second, but this time it was mixed with something else. Trust. The same trust that had been misplaced before, now shifting direction. "But Mom," he said quietly, this is not small." "I know," I replied, meeting his eyes fully now, letting him see that I understood exactly what we were dealing with, even if he did not yet have the full picture. "That is why you cannot treat it like it is." The room felt still around us, as if even the air had paused to listen. "Right now," I said, choosing each word carefully, "she believes everything is exactly where she left it. She believes you have not seen what you were not meant to see. And as long as she believes that, she will not change anything." He was quiet again, but this time it was not hesitation. It was processing. I could see it in the way his posture shifted, in the way his shoulders straightened slightly, as if something inside him was beginning to realign. "So what do we do?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried more weight than he probably realized, because it marked the moment he stopped reacting and started thinking. I allowed a small pause before answering, not to create tension, but to make sure he understood that what came next mattered. "We observe," I said. "We do not interrupt. We do not warn. We do not reveal anything she does not already know." He nodded slowly, the idea settling in, uncomfortable but necessary. "And in the meantime?" he asked. I glanced once toward the door, toward the sound of Olivia's laughter drifting faintly through the hallway, bright and confident, untouched by what had just shifted in this room. "In the meantime," I said, turning back to him, "you go back out there, And you act exactly the same as you have all evening. He let out a breath, almost a quiet disbelief, but he did not argue. That was new. Can you do that? I asked. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. Yes, he said. I studied him for a moment longer, making sure that answer was real, that it would hold when tested, because it would be tested. Then I gave a small nod of my own and stepped away from the desk. Good, I said. Because the moment she senses something has changed, everything we need to understand will disappear. I moved toward the door, my hand resting on the handle once again, the same position I had been in just minutes earlier, but this time the feeling was different. Before, I had been stepping back into something uncertain. Now, I was stepping into something I intended to see through to the end. I opened the door and let the sound of the party return in full, the warmth, the voices, the illusion of normalcy settling over everything once again. And as I walked back into that room, I did not feel like a guest anymore. I felt like someone who had finally been invited into the truth, even if no one else knew it yet. I stepped back into the room beside Daniel, and if anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed the difference in him, the way his shoulders were slightly more rigid, the way his eyes moved more deliberately from one person to another. But no one was watching closely, because no one ever does when everything appears to be exactly as it should be. Olivia noticed us almost immediately. Of course she did. She always noticed everything that mattered to her. She approached with the same smooth confidence, her expression bright, her posture relaxed, her presence filling the space in a way that felt effortless to everyone else but carefully constructed to me now. There you both are, she said, her tone light, almost playful. I was starting to think you had escaped without saying goodbye to anyone. Daniel smiled, just enough, not too much, exactly as I had told him, and I could see the effort it took for him to hold that expression in place. Just needed a minute, he replied. His voice was steady. Good. Olivia's eyes flicked between us for a brief second, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for me to register the calculation behind it. She was checking for something. A change. A signal. She did not find one. I stepped slightly forward, drawing her attention fully to me, and let a small, thoughtful smile settle on my face, the kind that invites conversation without demanding it. Olivia, I said gently, this house really is something. She relaxed almost instantly, her shoulders easing, her smile deepening just a fraction. Praise always had that effect. Thank you, she said, her voice warm, gracious. We put a lot into making it feel right. I nodded slowly, letting my gaze drift around the room as if I were simply admiring the details again, though this time I was looking at them differently, measuring them, placing them within a new understanding. I can see that, I replied. Then I paused, just briefly, letting the silence stretch in a way that felt natural, not forced, before adding. You must have handled most of the arrangements yourself. It was a simple sentence. Innocent. Almost complimentary. But I watched her closely as I said it, not her smile, not her posture, but the smallest shifts beneath them. For just a moment, something flickered. Not panic. Not even concern. Just a quick recalibration, as if she were adjusting her footing on ground she had not expected to move. Well, she said, letting out a light laugh. Daniel had his input too. I tilted my head slightly, as if considering that, then gave a soft, understanding nod. Of course, I said. Still, it takes a certain kind of attention to manage. Something like this. Another pause. Another beat. Especially when there are so many details involved. The word hung there, subtle but deliberate, and this time, the shift was clearer. Her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass. Just for a second. Then it was gone, replaced by the same composed ease she had been wearing all evening. But I had seen it. And more importantly, she knew I had seen something, even if she could not yet tell what. Behind her, Daniel remained silent, exactly as he should, letting the conversation unfold without interference, without drawing attention. Olivia smiled again, but there was a trace of something new beneath it now. Not doubt. Not yet. But awareness. It is all worth it in the end, she said smoothly. When everything comes together the way you planned. I met her gaze fully then, my own expression calm, unreadable, giving nothing away. Yes, I said quietly. It usually does. For a brief moment neither of us spoke. The noise of the party filled the space between us, laughter, music, the clink of glasses, all of it continuing as if nothing had shifted, as if nothing had been revealed. But something had. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Just a single thread pulled loose from a fabric that had been carefully woven. And as Olivia turned away to greet another guest, her movements just slightly more measured than before, I understood that this was how it would begin. Not with confrontation. Not with accusation. But with a question that did not sound like one, and an answer that revealed more than it was meant to. The rest of the evening moved forward as if nothing had changed, but I could feel it beneath the surface, a quiet shift that only I seemed to notice, like the faint hum of something electrical just out of sight. Conversations continued, glasses were refilled, laughter rose and fell in familiar patterns, yet every detail now felt sharper, more deliberate, as if the room itself were revealing things it had kept hidden before. I did not follow Olivia again after that moment. I did not need to. Instead, I watched from a distance, allowing her to return to her rhythm, to her carefully maintained control, because the more natural she felt, the more she revealed without realizing it. She moved easily from group to group, but I noticed how often her attention drifted back toward Daniel, quick glances that lasted no more than a second, checking, measuring, confirming that everything was still exactly as she expected. Each time, he gave her nothing. No hesitation, no tension, just the same steady presence he had carried all evening, and with each passing minute, her confidence began to settle again. That was important. Very important. Because certainty makes people careless in ways they never anticipate. I found myself near the kitchen island again, my fingers resting lightly against the cool stone surface, remembering the day we had chosen it, how Daniel had called me from the showroom, asking what I thought, sending me pictures, wanting my opinion on something as small as the color of the veining. At the time, I had felt included. Involved. Now I understood that involvement and ownership are not always the same thing. A guest approached me then, a woman I vaguely recognized from earlier, her expression kind, her tone polite. "You must be Daniel's mother," she said, offering a warm smile. I returned it easily. "I am," I replied. She glanced around the space, clearly impressed. "He has done very well for himself," she continued. I let the comment settle for a moment before answering. "Yes," I said, my voice calm, measured. "He has." I did not elaborate. I did not correct her. Because the truth, I had realized, did not need to be announced in order to exist. It only needed to be understood by the right people at the right time. As the evening began to wind down, guests slowly started gathering their things, offering congratulations, making plans to stay in touch, their voices softening as the energy of the party eased into something quieter, more contained. Olivia remained composed, gracious to the very end, walking people to the door, thanking them for coming, her smile never faltering, her tone never slipping. If anything, she seemed even more certain now than she had at the beginning of the night. And that told me everything I needed to know. She believed she had managed it. She believed whatever had been done was secure, unquestioned, invisible. Daniel eventually made his way back to my side, his movements more natural now, his earlier tension carefully tucked away beneath something steadier, something more controlled. He did not speak, and neither did I. We did not need to. The understanding between us had already been established. When the last guest finally stepped out and the door closed behind them, the house fell into a different kind of quiet, one that felt heavier, more revealing. Olivia turned back into the room, her posture relaxing slightly now that the performance was over, and for the first time that evening, there was no one else there to absorb her attention. Just the three of us. I met her gaze briefly, offering a small, polite smile, nothing more, nothing less. She returned it, just as easily, just as naturally. But this time, there was a fraction of a second where something lingered beneath it, something she had not fully hidden. Not fear. Not yet. But awareness that something, somewhere, was not entirely under her control. And as I stood there in the quiet of that house, I understood with complete clarity that whatever had been built here, whatever structure she believed was unshakable, had already begun to shift. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to know exactly where to begin. The silence that followed the closing of the front door was not uncomfortable, but it was no longer neutral either. It carried weight, the kind that settles slowly into a room once the performance has ended and there is nothing left to distract from what remains. Olivia moved first, setting her glass down on the kitchen island with a soft, deliberate motion, her posture loosening just enough to suggest relief, but not enough to lose control entirely. She turned toward Daniel, her expression shifting into something softer, more personal, the version of herself that existed when no one else was watching. "That went well," she said lightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Daniel nodded, his response measured, his tone even. "It did," he replied. I remained where I was, my hands resting loosely at my sides, observing the exchange without interrupting it, because sometimes what people say after everything is over reveals more than anything they perform in front of others. Olivia glanced at me then, her smile returning, but it was different now, quieter, more contained, as if she were recalibrating her approach based on something she could not quite define. "I hope you enjoyed yourself," she said. I met her gaze steadily, offering the same calm expression I had carried all evening. "I did," I answered. And again, it was not a lie. I had enjoyed it. Not for the reasons she assumed, but for what it had shown me. She studied my face for a moment longer than necessary, searching for something that was no longer there to find. Then she nodded, satisfied enough, and turned back toward the kitchen, beginning to gather a few things with quiet efficiency. Daniel remained still for a second, then shifted his weight slightly, as if waiting for a cue that did not come. I let the silence stretch just a little longer before speaking, not loudly, not sharply, just enough to redirect the moment. "It is getting late," I said, my tone gentle, almost routine. "I should head home." Daniel looked at me immediately, a flicker of something crossing his expression, something unspoken but understood. "I will walk you out," he said. Olivia did not object. She simply nodded, her attention still focused on the counter, but I noticed the slight pause in her movement, the fraction of a second where her hand stilled before continuing. We moved toward the door together, the hallway quiet, the lights softer now that the evening had ended. When we stepped outside, the cool night air felt different than it had before, clearer somehow, as if the space beyond the house held a truth the walls inside could not contain. Daniel closed the door behind us gently, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me, really looked this time, not as a son waiting for reassurance, but as someone beginning to understand the weight of what had been placed in front of him. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. I held his gaze for a moment, then let my eyes drift briefly back toward the house, toward the windows glowing softly against the dark. "No," I said, my voice calm, certain. "We let her believe nothing has changed." He nodded slowly, the answer settling in, even if he did not yet know everything it meant. I stepped forward then, placing a light hand on his arm, not to comfort him, but to ground the moment in something real. "This is not about reacting," I continued. "It is about understanding exactly what was done and why." He exhaled, a quiet release of tension, and nodded again. I gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, then turned toward my car, the gravel crunching softly beneath my shoes with each step. As I reached the driver's door, I paused, just for a second, and looked back once more at the house, at the place that had been presented as something new, something shared, something built on trust. From the outside, it still looked perfect. Untouched. Complete. But I knew better now. Because what they had built was not just a home. It was a structure of assumptions. And the moment those assumptions began to shift, everything else would follow. I opened the car door, settled into the seat, and closed it quietly behind me, the sound final, deliberate. As I started the engine, I did not feel anger. I did not feel regret. I felt something far more useful. Clarity. Because they believed I had been a guest in that house, someone invited in, someone who could be placed at the edges without consequence. They were wrong. And the next time I walked through that door, it would not be as someone who was unaware of what had been done. It would be as someone who understood exactly where she stood, and exactly what needed to be done next.